So in this video, we're going to look at rounding to 1, 2, and 3 significant figures. We're going to look at all sorts of examples you can face, such as leading zeros, what happens when there's a 9, all the cases that are listed on this slide. So just as a quick intro to significant figures. So for example, if you have the number 7, 9, 5, 4, and let's say you have a number 0.01052. Now the first significant figure is the first non-zero number. So in this case, this is the first significant figure. This is the second significant figure, this is the third, and this is the fourth significant figure. Now the first significant figure in this one is the first non-zero number, so it's that one. It's the first number that is not zero. Now the second significant figure is that one, so you only ignore the zeros at the start, okay? So let's make a start with that being said. So in this case, the first question here, well I should say the way my slides work, I'm going to do the example on the left, you're going to press pause and have a go at the example on the right. So it's saying round to one significant figure. So the first significant figure in this case is 1. We're going to draw a line after the 1. It's the first non-zero number. And we're going to use the number after the line, which is called the decider, to decide whether the number before the line is going to get rounded up or down. So if the number, the decider, which is that one there, if that is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, that means you round the number before the line up. So that means the 1 gets rounded to a 2. So the answer here is going to become 2, and everything after the line becomes a 0. There's a 0 there. So press pause and have a go at the example on the right. So the first thing is it's saying round to one significant figure. Draw your line after the first significant figure. Look at the decider. If the decider is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, that means you round the number before the line up. So this gets rounded up to a 2. Everything else becomes a 0. So again, with this one, I'm going to draw my line after the first significant figure. I'm going to look at the decider. Now, if the decider is 5 or more, so if it's 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, I round up. Otherwise, I leave it as it is. So in this case, the 1 stays as it is. Everything else becomes a 0. So hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at this one. Draw your line after the first significant figure. Look at the decider, which in this case is 4. Now, 4 is less than 5. That means I'm going to leave the 1 as it is. Everything else becomes a 0. So moving on. So again, round to one significant figure, draw your line after the first significant figure, look at the decider. If the decider is 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, round the number before the line up, so this becomes a 6, everything else becomes a 0. So again, draw your line. The number after the line is a 7, so the decider is 5 or more, so that means I round the 8 up to a 9, everything else becomes a 0. So now we've got 3-digit numbers, so it says round to one significant figure, draw your line after the first significant figure, look at the decider, which in this case is a 5, so that's telling me around the 1 up to a 2, everything else becomes a 0. So note here I said everything else, so there's 2 5s, they both become 0s. Draw your line, look at the decider, so in this case the decider is 2, so I don't need to round up, I leave the 1 as it is, everything else becomes a 0, so in this case there's 2 zeros. So in this case, the decider is a 0, so I don't need to round the 4 up. The 4 stays as it is. Everything else becomes a 0. Now hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at this. So in this case, the decider is a 5, so that means I round this 4 up to a 5. Everything else becomes a 0. So now we've got 4-digit numbers, but again, same principles apply. Draw your line, look at the decider, which is the number after the line, and then use that to figure out whether you round up or leave the same. So in this case, we leave it the same. And the number of zeros match the number of digits after the line. So in this case, it says round to one significant figure. I draw my line. I have a look at the number after the line to decide whether I round up or down. So in this case, I'll leave it as it is. So if this number was 5 or more, so that's 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, only then do I round up. So again, draw my line. There's no need for rounding here since the decider is 3. So in this case, I draw my line, look at the decider. Okay, so in this case, I do need to round up. So this 8 becomes a 9. Everything else becomes a 0. So in this case, there's 4 zeros. Draw my line. The 1 becomes a 2. Everything else becomes a 0. Draw my line here, look at the decider. So the decider is a 4, so I don't need to round up. So that stays as of 1. Now we're going to look at what happens when you've got a 9. So I'll draw my line, as usual, look at the decider, which is a 5. So that means I'm going to round up. Well, what comes after 9? 10. So that becomes a 10, and everything else after the line is a 0, so that's 100. Again, draw your line, look at your decider, which is a 7, so that's saying that the 9 is going to round up. It's going to round up to a 10, and then you put a 0 in after the line. So draw your line. Again, there's a 5 after the line, which means the 9 rounds up to a 10. Everything else becomes a 0. Again, draw your line, look at the decider. The 9 rounds up to a 10. Everything else becomes a 0, so in this case there's 2 zeros. Draw my line. Now in this case the decider is a 2, so there's no need to round, so the 9 stays as it is. Everything else becomes a 0. So in this case, hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go. So the decider is a 5. That's telling me that the 9 rounds up to a 10. Everything else becomes a 0, so that's going to be 3 zeros there. Now, press pause and have a go at these practice questions. When you're ready, press play for the answers. Here are the answers, mark your work. So we're now going to look at 2 significant figures. Now the second significant figure is that one there. So it's the second number. We're going to draw a line there. We're going to highlight our decider just like we did before. Now the decider is telling me I'm going to round the number before the line up. So the 5 becomes a 6. So my answer is going to be 1, 6. Everything else becomes a 0. So again, press pause and have a go at this. So it says second significant figure. Draw your line there. The decider is a 7. That's telling me the 3 rounds up to a 4. So my answer is 1, 4. Everything else becomes a 0. Again, draw your line after the second significant figure. Look at the decider. That's telling me around the 0 up to a 1. Everything else becomes a 0. So if you look at the one on the right, the decider is a 2. I don't need to round anything up. I leave it as it is. So we have a 4, 4. Everything else becomes a 0. So again, it says 2 significant figures. Draw your line there. Look at your decider. Now that's telling me to not do anything. I don't need to round up. So I leave the 1, 5 as it is. All the other digits after that become a 0. Draw my line. Now the decider is a 5. So I'll round the 4 up. That becomes a 5. For my answer is 1, 5. Everything else is a 0. So 1, 5, 0, 0. So rounding this to 2 significant figures. So the decider is a 5. I'll round the 4 up to a 5. So that's going to become 3, 5, 0, 0, 0. Draw my line after the second significant figure. The decider is a 4. So I'll leave the 2, 3 as it is. Everything else becomes a 0. So that's 3 zeros there. Round this to 2 significant figures. Highlight my decider. So I'll leave the 3 as it is. There's no need to round up. So in this case, the decider is a 6. It's telling me to round the 8 up. That becomes a 9. So that's 8, 9, 0, 0, 0. So now we're going to look at the case with 9s. So draw your line as usual. Highlight the decider, which is the number after the line. Now the 5 is telling me to round the 9 up. What comes after 9? 10. So there's a 0 there. The 1 carries over. And now we do 1 plus 1 here, which is 2. So my answer is 2, 0. And remember, everything after the line becomes a 0. So that's going to be a 0 there. So hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at this. Draw your line. Look at the decider. So in this case, the decider is less than 5. You don't need to do anything. Leave the 1, 9 as it is. Everything after the line becomes a 0. So in this case, the decider is a 1. I leave the 2, 9 as it is. Everything else is a 0. And hopefully you've pressed pause and had a go at this one. So the decider is a 5. The 9 becomes a 10. So there's a 0 here. The 1 carries over. Then I do 2 plus 1, which is 3. So my answer is 3, 0. And everything else after the 9 is a 0. So draw my line. Look at the decider. So it's 4, 9. So the key really is drawing your line at the right place. So draw your line there. Look at the decider, which is a 5. So the 9 rounds up to a 10. 1 carries over. 2 plus 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So that's 2, 0. Everything else after the 9 is a 0. Now we have decimal numbers. So it says round to 1 significant figure. So not to get confused this with decimal places. Okay, we are looking at significant figures. The first significant figure is the first non-zero number. So this is the first significant figure. That means I'm going to draw my line here. So once I've drawn my line, I look at the decider. Now the decider is telling me the number before the line rounds up. So the 1 becomes a 2. So my answer is going to be 2 here to 1 significant figure. So on the right, we have 1.4. Now if I'm rounding to 1 significant figure, draw your line after the first significant figure. the decider is a 4, so I don't need to do any rounding up. So we leave the 1 as it is. Okay, you do not need to write, you don't need the zeros after, because that would just be 1.0, and that's the same as writing 1. So we just leave that as it is, and it says give your answer to one significant figure. If you wrote 1.0, that's one significant figure, and that's the second significant figure, so that would be incorrect. So the correct answer here is the 1. I just want to highlight that point here. Moving on, we have 14.23 to one significant figure. So the first significant figure is 1. Draw your line after that. Now, this is a 4 with the decider, so that means we round the 1. We don't need to round the 1. We leave the 1 as it is. Everything after the line becomes a 0, and we don't need to write the decimal with zeros at the end. We can leave this as it is. So looking at the one on the right, so it says round to one significant figure. Draw your line there. Highlight the 5. Now, in this case, the decider is a 5, so the 2 rounds up to a 3. The answer here is going to be 3. A 0 for everything after the line, so we leave that as 3, 0. Moving on, so with this one, we have round this to one significant figure. So draw your line there. Highlight the decider. So we don't need to round up. The 1 stays as it is. Everything after the line becomes a 0. So that's 100 to one significant figure. Draw your line there. Now the 9 rounds up. After 9 is 10, so that's going to be 10 there. After the line, we have a 0 there. Moving on, it says round to two significant figures. So draw my line there. Look at the decider. So that means I round the 4 up to a 5. So my answer is 1.5. Now round this to two significant figures. Draw your line there. That's the decider. The 6 rounds up to a 7. So that's going to be 1.7 to two significant figures. Now, again, it says round to two significant figures. Draw your line there. Look at your decider. So that means I'll leave the 2, 5 as it is. So it says round to two significant figures. So draw my line through there. Look at my decider. So that means I'm going to round the 5 up to a 6. So the answer is going to be 36. And round to two significant figures. So draw my line there. Now, this one's a slightly tricky one. So this 9 becomes a 10. Carry the 1 over. This 9 also becomes a 10. So we have 100 as our answer. So round this to two significant figures. Draw your line there. That's a 0. So I don't need to round up. So that's a 1, 9. And we leave that 0 there as it is. So that's 190. Now rounding this to one significant figure. Now remember, it's the first non-zero digit. So this is not a significant figure. The first significant figure here is the 4. So I'm going to draw my line after 4. Look at my decider. That's telling me to round up the 4. So that becomes 5. So that's 0.5. Now to one significant figure, draw my line there. Again, ignore the first 0. The 7 is the decider. So that means I round the 6 up. So that becomes 0.7 to one significant figure. Now again, rounding this to one significant figure, we ignore the zeros at the start. So the first non-zero number is that one. So that's the first significant figure. Draw your line after that. Look at the decider. So that means I round the 4 up to a 5. So that's 0.05. Again, you don't need to worry about the zeros afterwards. In this case, as it's a decimal. So round this to one significant figure. Draw your line there. That 8 becomes a 9. You don't need to worry about the zeros afterwards. You can leave it as 0.09 since it's a decimal. So the first significant figure, remember, ignore the zeros at the start. So this is going to become a 4 here, since the decider is a 5. So that's going to be 0.004. Oh, let me just tidy that up a bit. 0.004. You don't need the zeros afterwards in this case, as it's a decimal. So looking at the next one, we have one significant figure. That's the first significant figure. That rounds up to a 9. So our answer is 0.009 to one significant figure. So this is saying round to one significant figure. So the first significant figure is the 1 there. Now if I look at the decider, I don't need to round up. So I'll leave that as it is. It's 0.01 to one significant figure. Again, I don't need to write all the remaining zeros. We only did that before, when we had whole numbers before the decimal. So looking at this one, round to one significant figure, that's the first significant figure. The decider is telling me to leave the number as it is, so that's 0.04. And rounding this to two significant figures, draw your line there, so that is going to be 0.46, as that is the decider there. That rounds up to a 6. So rounding this to two significant figures, put that there. The decider is a 5, so it's telling me to round the 7 up to an 8, so that's 0.68 to two significant figures. So now rounding this to two significant figures, draw the line right there. The decider is a 5, so I'll round this up, so that is 0.047. And again, draw your line there. The decider is telling me to round the 3 up to a 4, so that is going to be 0.044. So round this to two significant figures, draw the line there. The decider is telling me to leave it as it is, so no need for rounding. Again, draw your line there. The decider is telling me to leave it as it is, so that's 0.0089. So round this to two significant figures. So in this case, the second significant figure is that one. So you ignore the zeros at the start, but you don't ignore the zeros after the first significant figure. So in this case, this is the first significant figure, and this is the second significant figure. So in this case, I'll draw my line after the second significant figure, which is there. I look at the decider. It's telling me to not round anything, so my answer is 0.010. Now note, you do need this 0 here, because it says round to two significant figures, so I cannot say 0.01, because this answer is written to one significant figures. This answer is written to two significant figures. Okay, so this, just to make a point of that, this is wrong. That is what you need here. So make sure you read the question carefully. So here the question says give your answer to two significant figures. So the second significant figure is this 0 here. Draw my line. Highlight the decider. So the decider is telling me to round the 0 up to a 1. So in this case, the answer is 0.0081. Moving on. So it says round to two significant figures. So we have 2.05002. The second significant figure here is that one. So just careful here, because the first significant figure is now that one. I've put this here purposefully because it doesn't start with a 0. Just remember, it's only when it starts with a 0 that you skip the zeros. So this is the first significant figure, the 2, and the 0 is the second one. So the decider in this case is 5. So that's telling me to round this up to a 1. So that is going to be 2.1. You do not need these remaining zeros here. So again, round to two significant figures. So here's the first significant figure. Here's the second one. So draw my line there. Now I look at the decider. So the decider is telling me to leave things as it is. So that is going to be 4.0. Again, you do need the 0.0, because if you just wrote 4, that's to one significant figure. But 4.0 is to two significant figures. Now here's some practice questions for you to have a go at. Press pause and have a go. When you're ready, press play for the answers. Here are the answers. Mark your work. If you found that video useful, please consider subscribing to my channel. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.